You've probably never heard of these struggle meals, but your grandparents never forgot them. These forgotten dishes were cheap, clever, and sometimes downright strange. But behind every bite was a story of survival we shouldn't forget. When times got tough and cupboards grew bare, a dish known as milk toast with pepper quietly made its way onto American tables. Though admittedly more humble than glamorous, this forgotten staple exemplified resourcefulness over recipes. Popularized during the Great Depression, it consisted simply of warm milk poured over slices of stale, toasted bread, seasoned liberally with black pepper, a spice believed to help digestion, or perhaps distract diners from realizing they were basically eating soggy bread soup. Humor aside, the ingenuity behind this simple creation was pure survival and simplicity in action. Housewives stretching limited ingredients turned to milk toast with pepper not only as an affordable meal, but as a comforting remedy for upset stomachs and weary spirits. The dish became such a household staple that cookbooks of the 1930s and 40s included it as a genuine recipe, though today we might question if warm milk plus toast truly warrants being called a recipe at all. Nonetheless, the practice was clever. Bread past its prime found new life, and fresh milk was stretched further to fill hungry bellies. During World War II, resourcefulness and ingenuity became essential virtues, and American kitchens were no exception. Families navigating strict rationing found themselves facing butter shortages, turning instead to the unassuming yet versatile alternative known as oleomargarine, or oleo. Enter the forgotten classic, oleo spread and sugar sandwiches. This deceptively simple snack featured bread slices spread thinly with oleo and generously sprinkled with sugar, transforming minimal ingredients into something resembling dessert. Interestingly, margarine initially arrived as a colorless, bland block, accompanied by a yellow dye packet consumers mixed in themselves, a clever workaround since the dairy industry once insisted oleo remain visually distinct from butter. Housewives mixed and kneaded that coloring until the oleo took on butter's familiar golden hue, providing families with visual comfort amidst harsh rationing realities. Though it may sound suspiciously close to something your dentist would sternly advise against, the sandwich was surprisingly beloved by children of the era who eagerly accepted the sugary snack as proof that survival and simplicity could occasionally taste sweet. In households where frugality was less virtue and more necessity, even fruit peels had value, becoming the unlikely stars of a forgotten Depression-era classic, apple skin jelly. Born from a generation raised on survival and simplicity, this thrifty spread cleverly utilized what many today casually toss aside, the humble apple peel. After apples were peeled for pies or sauces, the leftover skins and cores were boiled down into a flavorful liquid, combined with sugar, and cooked patiently until it set into a surprisingly tasty jelly. Apple skins, it turns out, contain natural pectin, the very ingredient that gives jelly its distinctive jiggle, making store-bought gelatin unnecessary and costly additions irrelevant. In a prime example of resourcefulness over recipes, frugal homemakers discovered how to turn kitchen scraps into sweet, shimmering jars of deliciousness. During lean economic times, wastefulness was viewed as a luxury few could afford. Families proudly boasted pantries lined with homemade preserves, even if their jelly started life as peels destined for the compost bin. This inventive concoction wasn't winning awards at county fairs, perhaps, but it kept hungry bellies full and bread from tasting like cardboard. In the rural South, when meat became scarce, clever cooks turned to an unexpected hero hidden right in their gardens, the humble butter bean. From necessity sprang a surprisingly filling meal known as butter bean patties. Homemakers combined mashed butter beans with flour, onions, and whatever leftover spices they could scrape together, then fried the mixture until crisp and golden. These patties exemplified resourcefulness over recipes, providing nourishment when budgets were thin and grocery trips few. Butter beans, rich in protein, were an affordable substitute for meat, even if they wouldn't fool anyone into believing they were biting into prime rib. Interestingly, butter beans, also known as lima beans, became a Depression-era favorite precisely because of their high nutritional content paired with low cost. Today, lima beans might cause many adults to cringe, recalling childhood arguments at the dinner table, yet generations past embraced them as survival and simplicity embodied. In fact, resourcefulness and ingenuity transformed this oft-dreaded bean into something edible enough to serve as the centerpiece of supper. Imagine being so low on groceries that a few stale crackers become the centerpiece of dinner. During tough economic times, particularly in the early 20th century, resourcefulness and ingenuity gave birth to an unlikely creation: cracker soup. Popular among households facing empty pantries, it epitomized survival and simplicity, transforming basic crackers, warm water, and maybe a bouillon cube, if luck allowed, into a surprisingly edible meal. Recipes, if you could even call them that, weren't exactly precise. The process involved soaking crushed crackers in hot liquid until they softened, becoming something resembling porridge, but thinner, blander, and perhaps only slightly more appealing. Yet, despite its questionable culinary merit, cracker soup earned its place as a Depression-era staple, highlighting a generation's belief in resourcefulness over recipes. Intriguingly, some variations recommended using milk instead of water for extra calories, assuming milk was affordable. An Ohio cookbook from the 1930s even suggested improving the dish by stirring in leftover gravy, proving desperation often inspired creativity or at least an optimistic palate. When kitchen cupboards went bare, home cooks sometimes resorted to recipes so unusual they sound like practical jokes. But onion milk, a real and yes, edible creation from tougher times, stands as testament to survival and simplicity in American culinary history. This forgotten concoction involved boiling sliced onions gently in milk, forming a thin, mildly savory broth that doubled as comfort food and folk medicine. Early cookbooks claimed onion-infused milk could soothe colds and insomnia, a remedy reflecting resourcefulness and ingenuity more than culinary brilliance. Interestingly, the dish appeared frequently during harsh winters or economic downturns when fresh produce vanished and onions became reliable, lasting pantry companions. Onion milk highlights an era when resourcefulness over recipes guided every household cook. Families relied on ingredients that could both nourish and provide comfort cheaply, even if comfort came with a distinct onion aftertaste. Despite its admittedly peculiar profile, onion milk was so commonly accepted that some Depression-era families jokingly referred to it as poor man's French onion soup. Though, admittedly, without the crusty bread or gooey cheese, it was a stretch of imagination. In an era before cholesterol counts haunted dinner tables, cooks harnessed every drop of fat in the kitchen, crafting meals that turned scarcity into sustenance. Among these humble dishes was a rustic classic quietly known as grease gravy and bread, a Depression-era mainstay made by transforming leftover pan drippings into a simple, hearty gravy, poured generously over thick slices of day-old bread. Survival and simplicity combined brilliantly here. Flour was whisked into sizzling bacon fat or sausage drippings, creating a surprisingly flavorful sauce that elevated bread from bland filler into something approaching comfort food. For families living paycheck to paycheck, or no paycheck at all, this ingenious repurposing demonstrated resourcefulness and ingenuity in ways that today's foodie culture would marvel at, though probably wouldn't envy. Interestingly, recipes weren't typically written down. The pinch of this, dash of that approach turned grease gravy into an intuitive meal rather than a culinary masterpiece. Households adjusted ingredients daily, using whatever rendered fat lingered after frying or roasting, demonstrating true resourcefulness over recipes. In the early 1900s, families across rural America regularly practiced a culinary philosophy we've long abandoned. If it's edible, fry it. Nothing embodies this better, or perhaps stranger, than the surprisingly popular Depression-era specialty known as battered brains, better described as fried calf brain fritters. While today's diners may recoil at the thought, calf brains were once seen as an economical protein source, offering essential nutrients without emptying wallets. Home cooks soaked the brains, seasoned them simply, dipped each portion into a flour-based batter, and fried until crispy golden brown. Resourcefulness and ingenuity truly triumphed here, transforming an organ now seen mostly in horror movies into a legitimate main course. Interestingly, cookbooks from the era even recommended pairing these fritters with tangy sauces or pickles to mask the distinct, slightly metallic taste, confirming that survival and simplicity could also require clever camouflage. Although eating brains isn't likely to experience a culinary revival anytime soon, no one's waiting in line for brain nuggets. Historically, resourcefulness over recipes meant prioritizing nourishment above squeamishness. Most people today toss corn silk straight into the compost pile without a second thought, but there was a time when these silky strands played an unlikely role at American tables. Known as corn silk tea, this humble brew reflects how survival and simplicity turned even the most overlooked garden scraps into valuable resources. During hard economic times, especially throughout the Great Depression, frugal households regularly dried corn silk, the fine threads hidden beneath corn husks, and steeped them into a mild-tasting tea. Surprisingly, this wasn't just desperation disguised as culinary ingenuity. Corn silk actually contains beneficial nutrients, including vitamin K and antioxidants, and was often used medicinally as a folk remedy to soothe urinary issues. Resourcefulness over recipes meant that every kitchen scrap had potential, even something as humble as discarded corn threads. A cup of corn silk tea wasn't exactly luxury sipping. Think more barnyard chic than afternoon elegance. But Americans embraced it, sweetening it with molasses or honey if they could spare any. Ironically, nowadays health enthusiasts occasionally rediscover corn silk tea, packaging it as a trendy detox beverage and charging premium prices for something your grandparents drank out of sheer necessity. While today's cooks strain out cooking liquids without a second thought, folks raised during harder times recognize those broths as liquid gold. One especially notable example was turnip green pot liquor, an iconic staple across rural southern kitchens. This dish, more of a beverage by modern standards, was nothing more than the nutritious liquid left behind after boiling turnip greens. Yet, resourcefulness and ingenuity transformed it from mere cooking water into a sought-after tonic. Pot liquor, pronounced pot liquor by true Southerners, wasn't simply about survival and simplicity. It was genuinely prized for its concentrated vitamins and minerals, nourishing families who lacked access to fresh produce year-round. Historically, some households even reserved this savory broth to dunk chunks of cornbread, effectively turning modest kitchen scraps into meals. A funny twist: in the late 1930s, pot liquor unexpectedly sparked national controversy when a debate erupted over whether it was appropriate to sip it straight or dip bread, showing Americans could argue passionately about literally anything. Resourcefulness over recipes guided this unique culinary custom, proving that a good cook wasn't judged by fancy dishes, but by how cleverly they utilized every drop of nourishment. The notion of baking a cake without eggs, butter, or milk might seem like culinary blasphemy today, yet during the scarcity of the Great Depression and wartime rationing, this quirky concoction became a surprising symbol of celebration. Known fondly as wacky cake, or officially eggless, butterless, milkless cake, this dessert embodied survival and simplicity, allowing families to enjoy something sweet despite bare pantry shelves. Crafted from pantry basics like flour, vinegar, sugar, cocoa, and baking soda, this cake's chemical reaction magically provided lift and moisture. Chemistry class disguised as dessert. Resourcefulness and ingenuity were on full display, making it possible to bake a cake from essentially thin air, or at least whatever air remained in rationed kitchens. In fact, homemakers mixed the ingredients directly in the baking pan itself to conserve dishwashing water, proving once again that necessity doesn't just mother invention, it mothers shortcuts too. Surprisingly delicious, wacky cake wasn't just a treat, it served as an uplifting morale booster when optimism was in short supply. When gelatin first hit American kitchens, cooks eagerly molded just about everything they could think of into wiggly culinary experiments, sometimes with questionable results. Among these unusual creations stood tomato aspic, a savory gelatin dish beloved by Depression-era housewives who embraced resourcefulness over recipes. Made from tomato juice, gelatin, celery, onions, and occasionally whatever leftover veggies lingered in the icebox, tomato aspic's texture sat somewhere between a salad and Jell-O, making it possibly the least expected party dish to ever grace a dining table. Yet survival and simplicity motivated households to use inexpensive ingredients creatively, and gelatin molds allowed cooks to stretch minimal food supplies further than anyone thought possible. Interestingly, tomato aspic even had a moment as the epitome of sophistication, appearing in 1930s cookbooks and on wedding buffets, suggesting Americans were either impressively open-minded or deeply desperate to impress their neighbors. Resourcefulness and ingenuity turned this simple gelatin concoction into a cultural curiosity that persists today, primarily as comedic fodder at holiday gatherings. When food was scarce, families mastered the art of using every single part of the animal, no exceptions allowed. Perhaps nowhere is this ethos clearer or more eyebrow-raising than in the case of pickled pig lips. Popularized during times when wastefulness wasn't just discouraged, it was nearly criminal, these briny delicacies embodied survival and simplicity at its most extreme. To create this snack, pig lips, often considered mere butcher scraps, were thoroughly cleaned, boiled, and submerged into jars filled with vinegar brine, spices, and peppers. Resourcefulness and ingenuity allowed households to transform a part normally discarded into something edible, or at least something edible enough to serve guests brave enough to sample it. Historically, pickled pig lips gained a following in parts of the rural South, especially Louisiana, where pickling anything that moved became standard practice. Surprisingly, this snack remained a convenience store staple in parts of the Deep South into recent decades, selling right alongside beef jerky and potato chips, daring hungry customers to test their culinary courage. When butter, milk, and eggs disappeared from American kitchens during rationing, home cooks discovered baking shortcuts so unconventional that even Martha Stewart might have raised an eyebrow. Among these ingenious creations were vinegar brownies, a dessert born purely from survival and simplicity, yet curiously delicious enough to fool unsuspecting taste testers. Using vinegar in brownies sounds more suited for punishment than dessert, but resourcefulness and ingenuity taught bakers that a small splash could react with baking soda, creating fluffy, moist brownies without needing pricey dairy or eggs. Recipes appearing in wartime newspapers advised skeptical homemakers to trust the process, reassuring them that brownies wouldn't taste like salad dressing. Instead, vinegar left no traceable flavor, cleverly hidden behind chocolate's natural richness. Resourcefulness over recipes defined wartime baking, so much so that vinegar desserts even earned the label magic cakes, suggesting home bakers were as much magicians as cooks. Vinegar brownies became surprisingly popular, often served proudly at community events or packed in lunches as proof that rationing couldn't extinguish America's sweet tooth. While gravy today typically implies something rich, meaty, and perhaps indulgent, Americans facing lean times found ways to make even gravy economical. Enter dried pea gravy, a nearly forgotten dish that turned inexpensive dried peas into a surprisingly nourishing sauce. By boiling and mashing dried split peas, home cooks created a hearty gravy-like mixture that could generously blanket stale bread, boiled potatoes, or whatever starch was available. Survival and simplicity guided its creation. Peas, water, salt, and maybe onions or leftover bacon drippings for a flavor boost. Historically, split peas were prized for their affordability and long shelf life, becoming essential pantry staples during the Depression. Recipes weren't precise. Cooks simply adjusted ingredients to fit whatever they had or didn't have, demonstrating resourcefulness over recipes at its finest. Though pea gravy might not win culinary awards for creativity today, it filled stomachs and kept families nourished when every penny counted. Interestingly, dried peas also provided much-needed protein and fiber, making this humble gravy deceptively nutritious, something to keep in mind the next time someone tries selling you overpriced protein shakes. For families who lived through times when wasting food was unthinkable, Cooking often became an art of disguising scraps into meals that seemed intentional, or at least palatable. One notable example of this inventive philosophy was the infamous chitlin loaf. While chitlins, the cleaned and cooked intestines of pigs, already have a controversial reputation, resourcefulness and ingenuity took it a step further, pressing them into loaf form. Historically common in southern and rural Midwestern kitchens, chitlin loaf combined ground chitlins, cornmeal, spices, and sometimes onions or peppers, baked into something resembling meatloaf's eccentric cousin. Survival and simplicity guided cooks, who hoped shaping chitlins into neat slices might convince skeptical family members that it tasted better than it looked. Interestingly, chitlins became a dietary staple after slavery, as African American families creatively transformed discarded pig parts into nourishing meals out of necessity, influencing broader Southern cooking traditions. Resourcefulness over recipes indeed meant valuing calories over culinary reputation. Chitlins provided essential protein when meat was scarce. Peeling potatoes today usually ends with tossing the skins into the trash without a second thought. Yet, back when groceries were scarce and every bit counted, those humble scraps became the hero ingredient in potato skin hash. Originating in rural kitchens during economic hardship, cooks demonstrated true resourcefulness and ingenuity by turning leftover potato peels, often dismissed as culinary waste, into a hearty skillet meal. Survival and simplicity reigned supreme as homemakers sautéed these skins with onions, salt, and, if lucky, bits of leftover bacon grease, creating a crispy dish that stretched budgets further than a politician's promise. Interestingly, potato skins are remarkably nutritious, rich in fiber, potassium, and vitamins, something our grandparents discovered purely out of necessity. Resourcefulness over recipes guided these cooks, as they learned that potato peels provided both essential nutrition and comforting texture, elevating what might have been trash into tasty sustenance. During wartime rationing, American newspapers even recommended saving and using potato skins, viewing wastefulness as both financially foolish and patriotic malpractice. Today, meat suspended in gelatin might raise a few eyebrows and stomachs. But generations ago, this combination was considered a clever culinary strategy. Jellied veal, a now largely forgotten staple, took humble cooking practices to new gelatinous heights, reflecting an era when resourcefulness over recipes guided kitchen decisions. Made by boiling veal bones and scraps for hours until the natural gelatin emerged, the mixture was then seasoned, poured into molds, and chilled until firm. Survival and simplicity dictated every step, transforming leftover bones into something akin to edible sculpture, or at least that was the optimistic intention. Interestingly, jellied meats trace their history back centuries, appearing in medieval European banquets. Yet Depression-era American cooks revived this dish not for prestige but pure practicality, showcasing resourcefulness and ingenuity in stretching limited meat supplies. Homemakers often brightened this slightly intimidating dish with pickles, mustard, or vinegar, wisely attempting to distract diners from the fact they were essentially consuming meat-flavored Jell-O. Across American history, cooks have shown remarkable creativity in repurposing leftovers, though few dishes illustrate this more uniquely than cornbread coffee, a forgotten breakfast once common throughout the rural South. Born purely from resourcefulness and ingenuity, it involved crumbling leftover cornbread directly into a hot cup of coffee, then eating the mixture like a porridge. Admittedly, this meal won't win any awards for culinary elegance, but survival and simplicity meant using every last crumb in the pantry, even if it blurred the line between breakfast and beverage. Historically, cornbread coffee was especially prevalent among farming families who viewed coffee-soaked cornbread as practical fuel for a long day's labor. The caffeine perked you up, while the bread filled your stomach, though modern diners might question why anyone would turn good coffee into a bowl of mushy crumbs. Interestingly, some cooks enhance the dish with a splash of milk or sugar, possibly to soften the gritty texture or disguise the bitterness of the day's reheated coffee, again showcasing resourcefulness over recipes. Among the more inventive relics of Depression-era dining, Few dishes better demonstrate culinary resilience than the head-turning, gelatin-cloaked delicacy known as souse. Rooted in European peasant traditions and popularized across Southern and Appalachian communities, this dish was a direct result of survival and simplicity, transforming pig head meat, feet, and other trimmings into a chilled loaf through the natural gelling power of collagen. Often referred to as head cheese, though cheese it is not, Souse reflected a time when no part of the animal was wasted, not out of novelty, but because every scrap held value. After boiling the odds and ends until tender, the meat was picked clean from bone, chopped, and suspended in a tangy vinegar-based gelatin seasoned with onion, pepper, and sometimes hot spices. Eaten cold, sliced thin, and often served with crackers or bread, souse was a bold example of resourcefulness over recipes, a dish born from necessity and refined by frugality. Interestingly, its acidic tang didn't just enhance flavor, it also helped preserve the meat, giving it a longer shelf life before refrigeration was widely accessible. When apples were out of reach but dessert still needed to be on the table, home cooks turned to an unlikely hero sitting quietly in the pantry: saltine crackers. That's how the now curious creation known as mock apple pie or Ritz cracker pie made its way into American kitchens during the Great Depression and wu-tu. At first glance, it sounds like a prank in a pie shell, but it's a striking example of resourcefulness and ingenuity. By combining crushed crackers with sugar, water, lemon juice, and a dash of cinnamon, the filling managed to convincingly mimic the taste and texture of baked apples, without a single apple in sight. Introduced widely in the 1930s, the recipe even gained national attention after Ritz began printing it on the back of cracker boxes. The salt in the crackers balanced the sweetness, and the combination of acidity and spices created the illusion of fruit, an edible sleight of hand that fooled more than a few unsuspecting guests. It was survival and simplicity wrapped in a flaky crust, proving that dessert wasn't off the menu, even in lean times. Mock apple pie perfectly illustrates how cooks of the era embraced resourcefulness over recipes, turning everyday staples into stand-ins for luxury. Hard times demanded hard bread, literally. Among the humblest of struggle meals was a dish known as water zwieback, a surprisingly common sight on tables during the Depression and in the aftermath of war. Zwieback, a twice-baked bread of German origin, was prized for its long shelf life and durability. When fresh bread was gone and ingredients too scarce to bake anew, families relied on this crunchy standby. But eating it plain could challenge even the strongest of teeth. The solution? Survival and simplicity at its most basic. Soften it with hot water. Water zwieback was prepared by soaking the hard, dry slices in boiling water or broth until they became soft enough to chew. Sometimes butter, sugar, or leftover gravy was added, if any was available, though more often it was eaten plain, a dish made palatable more by necessity than by seasoning. Resourcefulness and ingenuity turned this culinary afterthought into a functional meal, especially for children, the elderly, or those recovering from illness. Interestingly, zwieback was also popular in military rations and among immigrants, carried across oceans for its durability. This meal, while forgettable to the modern palate, stands as a quiet symbol of resilience. In households where a cow was a luxury and store-bought milk was even rarer, families didn't give up, they improvised. One surprising solution came in the form of molasses milk, a frugal beverage that combined water, blackstrap molasses, and a splash of vinegar to simulate the tang and richness of real dairy. Though it wouldn't fool any modern barista, this mixture was more than just a poor man's stand-in. It was a testament to survival and simplicity, crafted out of sheer necessity. Blackstrap molasses, a byproduct of sugar refining, was cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with nutrients, particularly iron, calcium, and magnesium. Resourcefulness and ingenuity turned this sticky syrup into an essential kitchen staple. The addition of vinegar gave the drink a milk-like tang, and some versions were even poured over cornbread or used to moisten cereal, functioning as both liquid and sweetener in one. This wasn't about culinary pleasure, it was about nourishment when options were minimal. In fact, Molasses was heavily promoted during World War II as a patriotic sugar substitute, showing how even sweeteners were rationed with purpose. In kitchens where nothing ever went to waste, even hardened leftover biscuits found a second life. That reinvention came in the form of stale biscuit pudding, a clever, no-frills dessert that turned what would have been tossed out today into something warm, sweet, and oddly satisfying. With eggs, milk, sugar, and a bit of spice, when available, this dish exemplified survival and simplicity, transforming breakfast cast-offs into an after-dinner treat through baking alone. Stale biscuit pudding wasn't a written recipe so much as a kitchen instinct, passed down through generations that valued resourcefulness over recipes. Biscuits past their prime were crumbled or sliced, soaked in a sweet custard mixture, and baked until the whole thing firmed up into a rustic bread pudding. And if fruit, raisins, or molasses were available, they were gladly thrown in for good measure. It was dessert engineering on a shoestring budget. Resourcefulness and ingenuity drove every spoonful. During the Great Depression and wartime rationing, this kind of reimagining wasn't just practical, it was necessary. One 1940s homemaker's tip even suggested softening biscuits in leftover coffee first, adding another layer of flavor without spending a cent more. In households where every bite mattered and every scrap had purpose, even the shells left behind after shelling beans were given a second act. Known as bean hull soup, this deeply frugal dish is perhaps one of the clearest examples of resourcefulness and ingenuity on the American dinner table. The hulls, normally discarded once the beans were freed, were simmered slowly with water, onion, salt, and fat if available, creating a broth that was both simple and surprisingly satisfying. Survival and simplicity were more than themes, they were necessities. In rural farming communities, particularly during the Great Depression and Dust Bowl years, beans were a dietary staple. But when the beans were set aside for storage, the hulls were too valuable to waste. Resourcefulness over recipes meant no part of the harvest was ignored, even if that meant boiling what others threw away. Some cooks added potatoes or corn to stretch the meal further, while others simply served it with a chunk of bread to sop up every last drop. Though modern sensibilities might balk at the idea of soup made from shells, bean hull soup reminds us that hunger often inspires the most creative solutions. When budgets were tight and dinner had to come from whatever was in the pantry, few dishes offered the same comfort and convenience as creamed peas on toast. This humble meal became a regular fixture in American kitchens, especially during the Great Depression and wartime rationing. Canned peas, cheap, shelf-stable, and widely available, paired with a basic white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, could transform yesterday's bread into something that actually felt like a meal. It wasn't fancy, but that was the point. Toast, often made from the day-old loaf that was too dry for sandwiches, became the perfect base. The sauce stretched the peas just far enough to feed a family, and a pinch of salt and pepper gave it enough flavor to keep complaints to a minimum. Well, most of the time. As some kids joked, "Creamed peas again? Must be Wednesday." In truth, dishes like this were all about maximizing what was on hand. Rather than toss out stale bread or wait for fresh vegetables, families made do and made it work. The meal's simplicity masked its real strength, the ability to stretch limited ingredients into something warm, filling, and economical. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. At a time when the average household had to stretch every meal across days, not just hours, families learned to transform even the humblest scraps into something worth sitting down for. That's how bread and onion stuffing patties became a beloved standby. Originally a clever way to repurpose leftover stuffing from a holiday roast, these patties evolved into a standalone dish in kitchens that didn't always have meat to go with them. Using day-old bread, chopped onions, herbs, and whatever drippings or fat were available, home cooks shaped the mixture into small cakes and pan-fried them until golden. They were crisp on the outside, soft in the middle, and inexpensive enough to make in large batches. In some households, they were served with gravy, if any was left, or even a splash of vinegar for tang. The real genius of the dish lay in its simplicity. Onions were among the cheapest vegetables on the market, and bread was rarely wasted even when stale. Together, they offered flavor, texture, and enough substance to hold off hunger. Despite the frugal roots, bread and onion stuffing patties reflected a mindset where waste was unthinkable and where turning nothing much into something good wasn't a trick. It was a way of life. All right, let's talk about a real comfort food of the Depression: bean in tomato stew. Beans were a go-to ingredient during the Depression days because of how nutritious, affordable, and versatile they are. It's basically just what it sounds like: beans cooked in a tomato-based broth. But you could also throw in potatoes, carrots, and maybe even a little bit of rice for extra substance. The beans provided a good source of protein and fiber, while the tomato sauce added a burst of flavor. This stew could be enjoyed on its own or served over rice, bread, or even mashed potatoes if you were lucky enough to have them. Originally, Native Americans sweetened baked beans with maple syrup, but then someone decided to turn this protein into a stew, and hey, we're not complaining. It was a filling meal back in the day, and it's still cooked in many households around America where the budget is a bit too tight. I know this dish might sound plain, but believe me, when your belly is rumbling and your pantry is bare, this stew can be a lifesaver. Up next, we have a dish that was all about making the most out of simple ingredients: spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole. It can be argued that Eleanor Roosevelt did the best she could during the Great Depression. The First Lady promoted dishes to encourage savvy homemakers, such as a casserole made from spaghetti, boiled carrots, and a simple white sauce of milk, flour, salt, and butter. The spaghetti had to be cooked for 25 minutes. The idea was to get the noodles mushy so they paired nicely with the boiled carrots and a penny's worth of creamy sauce. The result? A vehicle for nutrition and nutrients. Families loved this dish because it was versatile and could easily be modified based on what was available. It was a great way to fill up hungry bellies without breaking the bank. It still makes a pretty delicious meal for potlucks, so if you want to impress everyone with something easy to whip up, the spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole will do. In Southern kitchens, a can of tomatoes and a bit of flour could go a long way. That's where tomato gravy and biscuits came in, a dish that made the most of simple staples when meat was scarce and money was even scarcer. Born out of the Great Depression and carried through hard times in rural America, this meal represented both necessity and culinary creativity, turning pantry basics into a filling breakfast, lunch, or dinner. The gravy was typically made by cooking down canned or fresh tomatoes with bacon grease or lard, then thickened with flour and water or milk. It was poured generously over biscuits, usually made from scratch using flour, lard, and buttermilk. Nothing went to waste. Leftover biscuits from the day before were often reheated and revived under a ladle of warm, tangy sauce. It wasn't meant to impress guests, but it sure impressed empty stomachs. In fact, the acidity of the tomatoes helped cut through the richness of the fat, creating a balance that kept folks coming back, even if it was the third time that week. Tomato gravy and biscuits taught generations that a humble meal could still be hearty, honest, and deeply satisfying. You hear the name rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. In households where meat was a rare luxury and leftovers were a way of life, nothing went to waste, not even the morning oatmeal. That's where oatmeal patties entered the picture. Made from leftover cooked oats, a few beaten eggs, breadcrumbs, and whatever seasonings were within arm's reach, these patties turned a humble breakfast item into a surprisingly satisfying dinner or side dish. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. Oats were, and still are, one of the most affordable pantry staples. They store well, cook fast, and offer fiber and protein without the price tag of meat or dairy. By the mid-20th century, many frugal families learned to repurpose them creatively. Frying leftover oatmeal into patties not only stretched resources, but also added texture and flavor to a meal that might otherwise feel one note. Often pan-fried in bacon drippings or lard, the patties were crisp on the outside, soft inside, and frequently served with gravy or a splash of ketchup. Some versions even added grated onion or cheese when available, making the dish slightly more decadent, by Depression standards at least. In the heart of the Great Depression, when pantries were bare and wallets were even emptier, home bakers got inventive in ways most modern cooks wouldn't dare attempt. Boiled water pie was one of those creations, a dessert made not with luxury, but with logic. Sugar, flour, butter, and water formed the base, and a bit of vanilla gave it just enough character to make folks forget it was essentially a pie made with hot water and hope. This wasn't a flaky, fruit-filled pastry to impress the neighbors. It was a triumph of ingenuity, born from empty cupboards and an unwavering desire to serve something sweet at the end of a hard day. The filling, thickened with flour and set in a basic pie crust, created a gelatinous texture, almost like a custard's frugal cousin. If there was no butter, lard worked. No vanilla? A pinch of cinnamon did the trick. Despite its simplicity, boiled water pie became a symbol of doing more with less. It used no eggs, no milk, and no exotic ingredients. just the bare bones of a dessert and a good deal of perseverance. This pie stood as quiet proof that even during the leanest seasons, people still found ways to sweeten life, one slice at a time. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies. And this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. No surprise that it was also known as one of the famous Desperation pies. Desperation pies are pies in American cuisine made using staple ingredients like butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and any other ingredients that cooks had on hand to complement them or substitute for ingredients that were out of season or too expensive. These pies were more common before refrigeration and canned pie fillings, and during times of hardship like the Great Depression and rationing of World War II. When fresh fruits were hard to come by, people turned to vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruits like apples and lemons. This cobbler used a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices to create a filling that, when baked, tasted surprisingly similar to a fruit cobbler. Instead of chunks of fresh apples, those on a budget would use apple cider vinegar to fake the acidic taste. The crust was made from basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and butter or lard. The dish reportedly tasted like a custard made from salt and vinegar chips, a rare dessert that leaves the roof of your mouth tingling. When refrigeration was unreliable and grocery runs weren't guaranteed, families leaned on ingredients that could last for weeks or even months without spoiling. That's how salt pork and potato stew found its way into so many cast iron pots across America. Salt pork, a cured cut of fatty meat, was cheap, shelf-stable, and added flavor to even the blandest of meals. Combined with hearty potatoes, onions, and water, it created a stew that could feed a whole family without breaking the bank. The key to this dish wasn't extravagance, it was economy. Salt pork could be rendered for its fat, browned for texture, and used sparingly to add depth to a meal otherwise dominated by starch. Potatoes, the workhorse of the poor man's pantry, offered bulk and nourishment, and were often grown right in the backyard. In some versions, a carrot or two might sneak in, but for many families, this stew relied on whatever root vegetables hadn't gone soft yet. Waste wasn't an option. Leftover broth could be saved and reused as the base for another day's meal. Though salt pork and potato stew isn't a regular on today's dinner tables, it once served as a practical solution to hunger, using preserved meat and humble vegetables to stretch both flavor and resources, one ladle at a time. I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents' baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was, but what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? The Great Depression might not have the most appetizing recipes, but the era did give the world the Kraft macaroni and cheese dinner. In 1937, Kraft heard about a salesman for the Tenderoni Macaroni Company of St. Louis going rogue and selling his noodles with packets of Kraft grated cheese attached. They hired the man to promote the concept and started selling it to cash-strapped Americans at the low price of 19 cents for 4 servings. Some variations of this comfort food even included cooked vegetables or even a can of tuna. It was a great way to feed the family without spending a lot of money, and it quickly became a favorite for kids and adults alike. Even today, it remains a beloved comfort food. During the leanest decades of the 20th century, resourcefulness in the kitchen wasn't just admired, it was expected. That's how liver loaf earned its place at the table. Organ meats like liver were inexpensive, packed with nutrients, and widely available at butcher shops, making them a practical choice for families looking to stretch their food budgets without sacrificing nutrition. Turning liver into a loaf wasn't just a culinary choice, it was a financial strategy. Ground liver was blended with breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, and sometimes a splash of milk, whatever was on hand, to create a dense, sliceable loaf. It resembled meatloaf in appearance, but had a distinct flavor that earned strong opinions in both directions. Some called it hearty, others politely passed it to the dog under the table. Either way, it got eaten. In terms of nutrition, liver loaf punched well above its weight, rich in iron, vitamin A, and protein at a time when supplements weren't sitting in everyone's medicine cabinet. And let's not forget the no-waste mentality. Using every part of the animal was standard practice, not an ethical trend. Families made it work because they had to, not because they wanted a cooking challenge. Roosevelt coffee was a beverage that people both created and drank much more out of necessity than commonly shared caffeine preferences or a newly acquired taste. People needed to make their coffee rations last as long as possible, and one trick they found out that greatly extended the duration of a batch was to reuse grounds. With the US already rationing coffee to a pound per household every 5 weeks, things were rough. The end product was a thin and watery drink that tasted close enough to a fresh cup while taking the real worries of spending more than they were able to on coffee off of people's shoulders. Honestly, it was not that bad either, and it was named Roosevelt coffee in honor of the president if you wanted some historical trivia to spice the drink up further. If you ever find yourself not being able to get some fresh grounds, maybe try making a batch of this and see how you find it. You may be just as surprised as Americans back then with each sip. Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Forget the meat aisle. What do you do when there's no meat? You make mock sausage. As you might have guessed, there was not exactly an abundance of food during the Dust Bowl era, so people started to experiment. The mock sausage was a mashup of anything remotely sausage-adjacent: meals, flour, grains, breads, spices, and perhaps a little oil if you were fortunate. To make it, you would combine these simple ingredients into a paste, form it into patties similar to sausage, and then fry. The result? A breakfast sausage knockoff of sorts. But come on, nobody was ever deceived here. Nevertheless, the spices did their job, and in the worst of circumstances, one must do the worst of things. They ate mock sausage with whatever was available: bread, beans, or boiled greens, and it was a regular part of survival food. The mock sausage was not only about feeding people, but also about maintaining everyday life's appearance. It provided families an opportunity to consume something that at least resembled something they used to know. What is even more astonishing is how these recipes sustained spirits, and how it is possible for flavor not to disappear even when the ingredients have. Today, mock sausage is quite popular in the vegan and vegetarian community. But back then, it was about making a meal out of every single grain you had and ensuring that it was filling. This is what you can say about making the impossible possible. In homes where budgets were tight and second helpings weren't guaranteed, even stale bread got a second chance. One surprisingly common solution was fried bread and milk, a dish that turned pantry scraps into a warm, satisfying meal with minimal effort and almost no cost. If the bread was too tough to slice, that didn't matter. It just needed to hold together in the pan. The method was straightforward. Slices of day-old bread were fried in fat, usually bacon grease or lard, until golden and crisp, then served in a shallow bowl with warm milk poured over the top. For added flavor, a pinch of salt or sugar was sometimes sprinkled on, depending on whether it was served for breakfast or supper. Simple, yes, but in many homes, it was comfort food. This dish embodied Depression-era efficiency. It kept stale bread from going to waste and made use of milk before it turned sour. Fried in fat, the bread became rich and filling, stretching small portions into something substantial. While fried bread and milk might sound like a minimalist cousin of French toast, it was never about indulgence. Okay, this one is a bit of a curveball. Cold milk soup? But hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. Cold milk soup was a Depression-era staple, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This dish has Amish origins and was one of the most popular meals back in the day. It was also pretty simple to whip up. Take some milk, mix in sliced bananas, a bit of sugar, and sometimes even bread or other fruits. And there you have it, cold milk soup. It might not sound like much, but for many families, this was a quick and easy way to get some calories and nutrients, especially when fresh ingredients were hard to come by. The bananas added some natural sweetness, while the milk provided protein and fat. It was a simple, no-cook meal that could be thrown together in minutes and was perfect for those hot summer days when turning on the stove was the last thing you wanted to do. Before lemons were regularly stocked in every grocery store, and long before bottled juice became a staple, resourceful cooks had to fake the flavor they craved. That's how mock lemon pie became a quiet legend in frugal kitchens across America. Devised during wartime shortages and Depression-era scrimping, this pie delivered the tang of citrus without a single lemon in sight. The trick was vinegar, mixed with sugar, water, a bit of flour or cornstarch, and a dash of butter. It created a filling that mimicked the sharp, sweet punch of lemon curd. A sprinkle of nutmeg or a touch of vanilla helped round out the illusion. Poured into a simple pie crust, often made with lard or shortening, it was baked until set and served with pride. This wasn't deception, it was adaptation. Lemons were expensive and hard to come by in inland or rural areas, especially in winter. Vinegar, on the other hand, was affordable, shelf-stable, and always on hand. As one cook put it, "It's not lemon, but it sure fooled the kids." Mock lemon pie wasn't a second-best option. It was a testament to making do without giving up flavor. If life hands you corn cobs, make jelly. This creation of the Dust Bowl is the best example of use it or else it will be used on you. Indeed, in the old days when food was hard to come by, one could not even discard corn cobs. Yes, the very same cobs that you discarded in the bin today were used to make a sweet golden jelly that was related to honey in taste. The process was simple. Take the cobs, boil them to get the corn starchy goodness, add sugar and pectin, and you have corn cob jelly. It was inexpensive, convenient, and could be slathered on the constant companion of the Depression: bread. The taste? Light and sweet with a very subtle corn taste. And let's face it, when you are living off of crumbs, any type of jelly is a treat. Corn cob jelly may not sound like a dish that could be eaten today, but during that period, it was the best invention to solve a real issue. Everyone wanted to get as much use out of every kernel of corn as was humanly possible, figuratively and literally. Now it is a recipe that one might find in a rustic fare or a book of curious recipes, but in the past, it was a true example of people's creativity. At the very least, corncob jelly makes us remember that life is a little sweeter when it's as corny as it is sweet. In kitchens where dimes were stretched and grocery trips were rare, even the simplest ingredients had to serve double duty. That's where cabbage and bread soup proved its worth. A dish that combined two of the most affordable pantry staples into a meal that was both warming and filling, if not exactly flashy. When meat was missing and stock pots were light, this soup stepped in to do the heavy lifting. The method was modest but effective. Chopped cabbage simmered in water or weak broth, sometimes flavored with onion or garlic if available. Stale bread was cubed or torn and added in, acting as both thickener and sustenance. A drizzle of fat, bacon grease, butter, or lard might have been added for richness, but even without it, this soup got the job done. Cabbage was prized for its long shelf life and high yield per penny, while bread that had gone dry was never tossed. It was repurposed. Together, they made a dish that respected every scrap, every cent, and every ounce of effort. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and don't forget to let us know which of these meals reminded you of your grandparents.